Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I want to show you this landscape done in colored pencils. I don't normally use colored pencils for drawing landscapes. I prefer to use them for portraits and things like that. But I thought that it turned out okay. And honestly, at the beginning I had no idea what it was going to look like because I didn't know all of the elements I was going to include. Eventually I decided to put this hawk here in the foreground, and I thought that it looked really nice because it not only balanced out the composition, it also made the whole drawing a lot more interesting. I'm going to take you through the drawing process, but before I do, let me just say a few words about the materials I used. I use a local brand of a paper called Hammer, and it's nothing special. It's about 190 GSM in terms of thickness and weight. And as for the pencils I mostly used Staedtler colored pencils. Again, these are nothing special, they are not particularly expensive, and for some of the for some of the details on the eagle I also used Faber-Castell brown because I didn't have the brown that I wanted. So most of the drawing was done in Staedtler colored pencils, but a few details were done in Faber-Castell colored pencils. Now let me just say a few words about why I mostly worked with these Staedtler colored pencils and not some other more expensive brands. I prefer to work in dry media and I really don't like to use solvents. And as you know, colored pencils don't blend too well. So when I blend, I mostly blend using the usual blending tools such as Q-tips, Totilians, brushes, and sometimes color blenders or a white color pencil for blending. So I'm kind of limited in terms of the blending abilities of my pencils. And one of the advantages of these Staedtler pencils is that they kind of leave a slightly paler mark. They are not as strong and vibrant in terms of colors. But that also allows you to blend a little bit more easily, and it also allows you to erase some of the details more easily. So I kind of like working with these, and sometimes if I feel like I need some more vibrant or stronger colors, I can combine them with Faber-Castell Polychromos or some others. But this was mostly done in Staedtler colored pencil. And I found it very suitable for these lighter colors which dominate most of the scene. And I'm also going to be showing you or explaining to you how you can create this nice feeling of distance in your drawing. For example, I'm going to be explaining you how I draw these mountains and how you can create a feeling of depth and distance in a landscape drawing. Now let's get to it. I'm starting with this light blue pencil. The size of the paper is 9 times 12 inches. And I secured it with some tape. This is roughly where the horizon will be. I'm going to have some mountains in the distance there. So colored pencils are a lot lighter than pastels. There's not as much pigment and you don't get these vibrant colors that you normally get with pastels. So you often need to layer them and maybe even use a little bit more pressure. So right now all of this is looking very light. But that's okay because I wanted the whole scene to be a little bit lighter, except for a few things in the foreground. So one of the things that you see me doing now is that I used a bit of cross-hatching to increase the amount of value, and now I'm just using a Q-tip to blend that. A lot of people like to use solvents. I don't like to use them. I also don't like using those color blenders too much because they burnish the surface of the paper, and then it's very difficult to get some work done afterwards. But when you have these colored pencils like Staedtler's, which aren't as vibrant in terms of colors, but they leave a slightly lighter trace, they're kind of easier to blend and erase, so a Q-tip can sometimes help a little bit with the blending. What I'm doing now is I'm using a tapered stroke, because the tapered stroke, it's a one-directional stroke. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm just drawing in one direction and I'm trying to create seamless transitions, and a tapered stroke really helps when you want to create smooth transitions. It just requires a little bit of patience. But what I'm doing now is basically I'm trying to make the top part of that sky a little bit darker than the lower part, because the lower part is going to be fading and it's kind of going to be merging with the mountains in the distance. It's still going to be bluish, but I want the top part to be just a little bit darker. And again, I'm using a Q-tip to blend that, and of course a Q-tip can't do everything, but it helps a little bit. Right now I'm using a pencil eraser. This is a Kohinoor pencil eraser, and I'm drawing the clouds. So basically I'm just erasing some of the blue that I put down initially with my colored pencils, and I'm just trying to make some suggestions of clouds here in the sky. And one of the things to remember when you're drawing the clouds is that generally the top edge of the clouds is more defined than the lower one. So the top part of the cloud stands out in contrast against the sky a little bit more than the lower one. So I'm going to have less and less contrast as I move lower down to the horizon. And now I'm starting to work on these mountains in the distance, and I drew the first one and I'm blending it a bit with a tortilla. I'm going to draw another one here on the other side, but you can see how lightly I'm drawing these two peaks. They are far in the distance and they're barely visible. They are barely visible because they're so far away. And this is another thing that I wanted to talk about. If you want to create an illusion of depth and distance in your landscapes, you have to be aware of the atmospheric effect. So the further you look into the distance, the more things start to fade, and the less defined they become. There is less contrast, less detail, less texture, and everything becomes a little more pale in terms of color and a little more bluish. That's why I'm still using this blue, light blue color for these hills and maybe mountains in the distance. And I'm just blending that a bit with my usual blending tools, because I don't really need to do too much blending. And you can also see that I added a touch of that darker blue, both for the sky and the hills. That darker blue has a little bit more of the red in it. So I already have some hills in the distance, and you can see that the ones that are in front are slightly darker than the ones that are further behind. So if you want to create an illusion of distance, all you have to do is make the hills in front a little bit darker and a little bit more defined. So right now that terrain is starting to take shape. But most of the grass here in the midground and the foreground is going to be yellowish, and I'm going to use this ochre, and I'm going to kind of blend from the lower part of the paper in towards the middle, and the bluish area and this yellowish area are going to be meeting around the horizon, around those mountains. where the most distant mountains are going to be very pale and bluish, and the ones that are closer to us are going to be covered with green and yellowish tones. But I'm going to make a very soft transition between the two using a Q-tip for blending. Like I said, these colored pencils are a little bit easier to blend because they are a little bit lighter. There's not as much pigment, and they are not quite as waxy. The colors aren't as rich, but that's actually helping me with these lighter, smoother transitions. So here, as you can see, I'm already making some suggestions of distant trees on some of the mountain tops or hilltops, whatever they are. That's why I'm adding a little bit of green and a little bit of this darker blue. I can't make it all green because it's still in the distance, and I still need a little bit more of those bluish tones so that I can retain that atmospheric effect of distant hills. But as you can see on the right, I am already making some suggestions of hills which are covered with trees. These trees aren't really defined right now. I just made a bunch of small vertical lines and dots just to make some suggestions of trees, but they are going to be getting larger and more defined the closer we move to the foreground. So now on this hilltop over here, I'm drawing some trees which are already a little more visible and a little more defined, and I'm using a combination of olive green and some black and some blue. But here on the other side, all the way on the left, I'm going to draw a large tree in the foreground. It's going to be something like a pine tree. And for the base color, I'm going to use this olive green, but I'm going to be making it a little bit darker with the black, and I'm going to be modifying the color a little bit with that darker blue. So let me explain quickly what I'm doing. I'm drawing these needles essentially because coniferous trees, they don't really have leaves, they have needles. And just like leaves, these needles form clusters which form around the branches. So I am going to try to draw a shape that kind of looks like a coniferous tree, and they generally have long tree trunks and branches growing out to the sides, and they have usually have a mostly conical tapering shape, but of course, because they are trees and the branches and the boughs grow every which way, these shapes are going to be very irregular, and I want them to be irregular so that they would look a lot more realistic and organic. So I went over the olive green with a little bit of that blue, and then I went over it with some black, and that way I'm getting a color that looks a lot more realistic, but I'm also getting some variation in the value so that we can feel like there's some shadows and shapes in those clusters of needles there. I don't want that to look flat. I want it to look like it has some shape and depth. I'm just going to keep drawing the rest of this trunk and some branches which are growing to the side. I don't really have to worry too much about their shape right now. If I knew that I wasn't going to cover most of it with these clusters of needles, then I would probably pay more attention to the shape of the branches. But right now, I'm just making some suggestions of where the branches will be, because a lot of it will not be visible. And I'm going to be covering it with some darker tones. So I'm just going to keep drawing some smaller branches growing out of these larger ones, and I'm going to keep drawing these clusters of needles, and you can see how my tree is starting to take shape. And another important thing that's kind of going on here in the foreground is that you can see that I'm creating a large amount of contrast because I'm actually using a lot more pressure for this tree in the foreground. I want the colors to be stronger and more vibrant, and I want more contrast. So the background is largely consists of very light colors. It's very pale colors, and it's barely there, as it were. But the objects in the foreground are going to be quite a bit more defined. I'm going to use stronger, darker colors, and I'm going to want to produce a lot of contrast with that background so that I can create more depth. So I keep doing what I already explained with this canopy of the tree. I keep using a combination of three colors, essentially this dark blue, the green, the olive green, and the black. Some people don't really suggest using black in these situations, but I love combining black with other colors when I use colored pencils, and I have no problem with that. If somebody doesn't like the effect, well, I'm sorry about that. This is just my approach. I think it works. And right now I'm just going to keep drawing these clusters of needles. I still don't have, at this stage I still didn't have a clear idea about what the shape of the tree was going to be, but you know, as you keep adding the branches and you keep adding these clusters of needles, the shapes start presenting themselves to you, and you start to get some new ideas, and you start to get a better idea of what you want the tree to look like. So I want an irregular asymmetrical shape, but which is mostly conical and kind of tapering towards the top, so that it looks like a coniferous tree, and I think I'm achieving that. But as you can see, most of it is now covered in this olive green, and like I said, I'm using quite a bit more pressure than I did on the background. But that's okay, because I want the tree to stand out in contrast with the background. And right now I'm gonna use a little bit more of this black colored pencil, and I'm not just going to use it randomly. I'm going to use it on this tree trunk for two reasons. First, I want the tree trunk to be darker. Obviously the tree bark is of darker color. It's kind of grayish brown in this case, but also because the tree trunk is, and most of these branches also are largely in the shadow, because these thick clusters of needles are blocking the sunlight and casting a shadow onto the branches and the trunk. I'm going to want to make it a lot darker, so I'm not just randomly adding patches or areas of darker value. I'm kind of placing them in between these lighter areas so that they look like areas of shadow which are deeper in the shadow, deeper in the canopy of the tree. And I'm just adding some smaller branches here and there just to make the whole structure of the tree a little bit more interesting. And another thing to remember about the branches is that they taper as they grow, so I want to go over them a few more times near the base where they're attached to the rest of the tree trunk, so that they are thicker and that they get thinner and thinner as they grow out to the side. And now I'm using that black to go over these olive green areas and to give some more shadow and some more variation in value to these clusters of needles that I drew previously. And I'm not only giving the tree a little bit more texture, I'm also modifying the overall color a little bit so that it looks more realistic, a little bit more dull, a little bit darker, and a little bit more like what you would see in an actual coniferous tree. But it's kind of yellowish green, a little bit too much, so I'm going to be adding some more of that blue a little bit later. If I feel like I need to soften some of that texture, I can always go back with a lighter color on top of the darker color, so I can use that olive green on top of the black, and I can sort of blend these two together a little bit more. And now I'm moving on to some more trees here in the background. I'm going to have lots of these rows of trees in the background on these distant hills, and the closer the trees are to us, the more defined they're going to be. So the ones that are further back are almost going to be like tiny shapes, almost like ants or something. So they're almost going to be like dots. But the ones that are closer to us, they're going to be a row of small vertical tapering shapes. The ones that are further back are going to be a lot less defined. I can throw them randomly here and there, creating some discontinued shapes. Like maybe it's not just all one connected forest, but patches of trees here and there on top of these hills, to make this terrain and this background a little more interesting. I'm moving closer to the foreground here, as you can see, and I'm drawing taller and taller and larger trees. My approach to drawing these coniferous trees is very simple. I kind of draw a vertical line just to give myself an indication of where I'm going to place the tree and the overall shape and the size of it, and then I grow out, and then I draw the horizontal shapes, which are supposed to signify these branches growing out to the sides. So I'm just going to draw a few more of those trees in the lower right corner. I'm trying to vary their shape a little bit. Maybe like there are different types of trees there, and they vary in terms of both shapes and sizes and everything. And now I'm going to use that ochre color to go over the terrain a little bit more, because I felt that it was a little bit too light, so I'm adding some more value to it. But I still want the further area, which is closer to those distant hills, I want it to be lighter. And I'm also adding a little bit of the yellowish color to make those tones just a little bit warmer. And then I'm going over those distant parts with a bluish color again to make that transition really soft. And I'm also using a brush to soften that area so that there isn't too much texture. I'm going over these hills trying to create some suggestions of shapes. I'm not doing that either entirely randomly. I'm trying to create some texture to indicate the flow of the terrain, I guess. And just trying to create some illusion of detail and illusion of shapes without actually putting too much work. That's the way you normally do things when you draw landscapes. And now I'm going over some darker colors with over these trees in the distance. I'm using a black to go over these trees in the midground over there. And I'm using also this blue to make it a little more bluish. And I'm also defining these mountain tops in the distance just a little bit more. I'm going to go over these trees here, which are closer to us on the right, with a little more black, making some of them a little bit darker, adding a little more shadow, defining them a little bit more, and maybe adding some random trees here and there, or some patches of trees here and there, just to make the whole scene a lot more interesting and not to have too many of these empty spaces. Occasionally I go over everything with a brush to blend everything in together, because a stiff bristle brush can actually move that pigment from the colored pencils a little bit. So the blending tools that I'm using are working to a certain extent, and as long as you keep those strokes very light and you make sure that you layer everything patiently, you shouldn't have problems blending with those traditional blending tools. Like I said, I just prefer working on a dry piece of paper using dry media, so I don't like solvents. And I think the scene is going to turn out nice even without the use of solvents. I'm still going to be able to blend everything in and create a sufficient amount of value and some vibrant colors, at least in those areas where I want them, even though the overall area the overall scene rather, is going to be a little bit dull and a little bit lighter in terms of color. I'm using that black again to add some really dark areas in that tree trunk, or rather in that canopy, adding some really dark clusters of needles, and maybe adding a few more branches here and there to make the whole tree more complex and more interesting. And another thing that you can see about these branches is that they are not entirely visible, so some parts of them are obscured, so I want to make it look like some of those clusters of needles are in front of the branches and they're obscuring the branches and the tree trunk. So I want to create an illusion of depth, like the branches are behind some of these clusters. And another thing that I'm doing, I'm making some of these clusters a little bit darker than the others so that we can feel like they're deeper in the shadow, again trying to create some more depth. And I'm mostly shading the lower parts of these clusters a little bit more, making them a bit darker, because the light source is usually coming from above, from the sky and the sun, and that's why all of the shapes will be slightly lighter on the top part, on the top side, and they're going to be a little bit darker on the lower side. And now I'm using the dark blue to modify the greens that I have slightly so that they look a little bit more like the actual colors that you may see in nature. And I added this long branch on the side here on the lower part of the tree because I didn't like the overall shape of the tree. I just felt like something was missing there, and I wanted to I don't know, I just felt like creating a slightly different shape. That's the way it is when you're drawing trees. If you feel like you don't like a shape, like for some reason it doesn't appeal to you or it doesn't look realistic to you, you can just modify to your liking. After all, it is your world when you're drawing. So right now I'm pretty happy with the way the tree is turning out. I just need to modify some of the details. I don't like how some of these darker areas are placed, so I'm just going to modify them slightly so that they kind of make more sense to me, and turn them into some shadow areas which are closer to the tree trunk and deeper in the shadow of the canopy of those clusters of needles and the branches. But the tree in the foreground is looking good, it's looking realistic, and the most important thing is that it's a lot darker than the background. We have a nice bit of contrast with the background. That's basically what I was going for. Another thing that you can do for blending is you can use a white colored pencil to go over some of the areas in the distance to soften them, make them a little bit muddier and blurrier, to remove some of the texture, because generally you always want to have more texture in the foreground than in the background, so the background always needs to be blurrier. So if you feel like you need to make the background even blurrier, you can always use a little bit of white colored pencil to blend those colors in and kind of muddy them a little bit to make them less defined. And now I'm just finishing some of the details on the trees here on the right, adding some darker values to them, adding some more texture and shadow to them, and at the same time making the composition a little bit more balanced, because I need some areas of darker value in the lower right corner as well. And again, I'm adding some more suggestions of variation in the terrain. I actually used a slightly darker brown on the terrain there. It's not all ochre. So at this point I was pretty happy with the way the scene turned out, but I kind of felt like something was missing. So I grabbed a brown pencil, and I decided to add a bird in the foreground. I wanted to add a hawk here in the foreground, flying slightly more on the right side of the paper. And of course there's always a danger that you might mess the whole thing up, because the landscape is looking pretty good, but I just felt like I needed to add a little something to make the whole scene a little more interesting. And I started sketching the shape of the bird very, very carefully, because colored pencils are not easy to erase, so there's not much room for mistake here. So I started sketching out the shape of that bird with its large wings spread out, and it's supposed to be something like a hawk, probably flying and searching for prey. And I drew a sketch of its spread out wings, and when I had a sketch in place and I was happy with the size, I started working on the details. I first used a little bit of the yellowish color for the feet and the beak, because I'm going to have some lighter yellowish details there, so I just left that there and I proceeded to work with some darker colors. And like I said, at this point I used a little bit of Faber-Castell brown pencil, and I also used a little bit of gray here, because there's going to be a grayish area here under the wing. But in addition to the Staedtler colored pencils, I also used this Faber-Castell brown. I think it was burnt umber, maybe, I'm not sure. But I just didn't like the browns that I had. The Staedtler browns that I had, they were a little bit too light, and I needed something a little bit stronger and a little bit darker. So I used the lighter Staedtler brown for the for most of the shading, and then I went over it with a darker brown to draw in some of these darker details. And eventually I'm also going to be using black and some other colors to add some more tones, but here on the tips of the wings I had to make them very dark, so I used a bit of black colored pencil on them as well. And then I had to kind of focus on the shape and the structure of these wings, because there are a lot of these individual feathers, and they have their they have some nice variation in the color, so I had to get the color right and the pattern right. And I also had to position them in a proper way so that it looks like an actual wing, because wings are kind of stacked in layers, or rather feathers are kind of stacked in layers in a wing, and you can see that they also vary in terms of both their shape and their length. So the ones that are further away at the tips of the wing are the largest, and the ones that are closer to the body are a little bit shorter. So I had to take all of these things into account, because I wanted to make the bird fairly detailed, and that's why I created so much texture and detail on those wings. And the reason why I had to make it detailed, obviously, was because if you look at the whole scene, the bird is kind of in the foreground, so it needs to be more detailed than the rest of the drawing. So here I kept fidgeting with the beak and the head. It's very small, so I didn't really have too much space to maneuver in order to create a realistic looking head. But I did my best, and I also added a little bit of that ochreish yellow tones to the bird, because I have those tones in the background, but I could also see some of those tones in the reference photos that I examined. So now I'm working on this tail and the tail feathers, again adding some variation in color and shape there as well, using the same combination of pencils, so mostly a couple of browns, a gray and a black for the darkest, deepest shadows. And I'm just modifying some of the shapes and the shadows, and I like the amount of detail that I achieved on the bird considering its size, because it's not very large. I mean, it's just a few inches. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other wing as well. I laid down a little bit of grayish color, and then I started adding some darker brown tones and defining the individual feathers and the layers of feathers and things like that, so that it looks like an actual wing. I'm really glad I came up with this idea to put that hawk in the foreground, because without it, I think it would be a nice landscape, but I think it would be a little bit too simplistic, so I think it really improved the overall appearance. And another thing that I'm doing is I'm using a white colored pencil to soften some of the texture on that tree, because I didn't want it to be too distracting. I now have two things competing for the focus here, the tree and the hawk. I want the hawk to be the first thing that grabs your attention in this scene. So I softened the tree a little bit. And here it is. The drawing is now finished. I removed the tape and I sprayed it with some fixative. I'm just going to add a tiny signature hidden here among these trees in the lower right corner, and that's going to be it. So I hope you like this landscape done in colored pencils. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to check out my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.